Hello, welcome to this edition of Los Altos History. I'm your host tonight, Gary Carson Hull, and we have with us in the studio tonight three very special guests, Ed Woodworth, Marjorie Robinson Bryant, and Edgar McDowell. These three persons sitting here with me are three people that we affectionately refer to as the old-timers. They are people that have been around Los Altos longer than I've been on this earth. And Ed Woodworth, I first met you, Ed, when we served on the Historical Commission together a few years back, and came to know Ed quite well and found him to be a wealth of information about Los Altos. Ed, why don't you introduce our other two guests tonight?
Thank you, Gary. I'd like to say for Marjorie and Edgar and me that we're delighted to be invited here. Our enthusiasm wasn't even squelched when we learned that you found we were the only three people old enough to remember Los Altos prior to 1920. But nevertheless, let me first introduce Marjorie Robinson Bryant. Marjorie is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, Al Robinson and Faith Robinson, who historians recognize the name. Al Robinson was the first one to start a grocery store in Los Altos. Marjorie probably has the distinction of being the first child born in the new community of Los Altos after 1909 when electricity came in and water. Well, I'll get back to you in a minute, Marjorie. Edgar McDowell is one of the distinguished citizens of Los Altos. He probably has done more for scouting in Los Altos than any one person on earth. But his history of Los Altos goes back earlier than that, because as I recalled, Ed, your father at Stanford had some connection with Los Altos, which I'm sure you'll tell about later. Your home resulted from that connection. And then later you worked for the Southern Pacific as assistant to the president for 50 years?
Well, I worked for the Southern Pacific for 42 years.
42 years.
But I wasn't assistant to the president all of that time.
Well, most of the time. We'll just leave it that way. And at any rate, I think Ed probably, Gary, is as well informed on the historical background in relation to the Southern Pacific as anybody I know. So with that, where would you like us to go?
What we would like to do here tonight is to do some reminiscing about what early Los Altos was like. I know Marjorie was here before the two of you gentlemen, but we'd like each one of you to do a little bit of reminiscing, and we've got some pictures that we've gleaned out of our historical archives at the History House that we'd like to share with our audience. And so just take it from there, Ed.
Well, Marjorie, what would you think of our starting with some of your family background before we get into history? Now, as I recall it, your family moved into a cottage on what is called the Merriman House, was also known as the Winchester House, the original farmhouse in Los Altos. And you lived there for a time. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Well, it was about 1908 when my mother and father, as a young married couple, came down to Los Altos from Berkeley. And they moved into this cottage, which was on that property that you mentioned. The property at that time was being run as a girls' school. And this cottage had been used for people who came to visit or for teachers occasionally. And they lived there until their own cottage on Orange Avenue was built. And it was finished about 1910. And they moved into that. And it was the only house on the block at that time. There were just fields on each side of it. And but there were houses on up Orange Avenue between our cottage and the Chandler School.
Do you recall when your folks moved into the house on Orange Avenue, was your Uncle Guy Schaup already in his house at that time?
He came shortly after that, and he rented. His house was built while he was living in another cottage on University Avenue, and then the Paul Schaups came after the Guy Schaups. They were the last.
I recall.
Had been Paul's idea that we all came to Los Altos.
Marjorie, tell me something. You know, I've always been curious about this. I know Ed has the answer too. But your parents and the Guy shops were very active ever since Los Altos was started. Paul's shop, your uncle, was active, but in the background. We never saw as much of him. Was that?
Well, we never saw as much of him either
Is that
because
so?
he was due to business
Right.
reasons.
He was in the
had to
city.
keep an apartment
Yeah.
in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And he really lived in San Francisco during the week and would come down and be with the family, his own family, on weekends.
I see.
And that was the reason why he didn't take such a visible part
Yeah.
in Los
He was a
Altos
very
affairs.
fine man. I as a boy, I knew him, but I never knew him as well as I did your folks or the Guy shops.
Yes, no, you wouldn't.
And of course, Gary, as you know, Marjorie is the niece of Guy shop, the niece of Paul shop, and her mother was Faith, the sister of Paul
Right.
and Guy. Well, let's go over to Ed a little bit here, and Ed, tell us, how did your folks get interested in Los Altos? How did your father become involved in Los Altos?
Well, my father was assistant registrar at Stanford starting 1900. On the side, he was also the representative at Stanford of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And in that connection, he came under the jurisdiction of Paul Schaup, who at that time was the district freight and passenger agent for the railroad at San Jose. And they became good friends shortly after 1900 and continued that way for the rest of my father's lives. The Southern Pacific Railroad had its main line, of course, ran from San Francisco to Los Angeles through San Jose. And then they had a branch line from San Jose that went through Los Gatos to Santa Cruz. They wanted to have a shortcut that would eliminate going to San Jose and then over. And so they started plans to build a line from Mayfield, which was
Mayfield is now South Palo Alto.
It's now part of
Right,
Palo Alto,
yeah,
a little
uh-huh.
bit south of what was then Palo Alto, to Los Gatos. And the line that they laid out would go right through the property that was owned by Mrs. Winchester or Mrs. Merriman or both of them. And those two women were not anxious to have a railroad come right through the middle of their property.
Understandably.
And Mr. Schaup was by then working in San Francisco on a higher up position in the Southern Pacific, but when he had been at San Jose, he had come over in this area and had formed the idea that this would be a pretty desirable place to live. And so somehow behind the scenes it was worked out that a company, I think known as the Los Altos Company, was formed by Mr. Schaup and some of his friends, and they, either directly or through some intermediaries, made a deal to buy the entire property owned by the Mrs. Winchester, Mrs. Merriman. And then they, in turn, were able to give the railroad the right-of-way without any hang-ups at all. And right after that, then, why they undertook to subdivide this property, set up a business section. Main Street, about 1st to 2nd was really the original business section.
Right.
And then they tried to bring people down from San Francisco and other places on weekends, Sunday in particular, and tried to sell lots to them. And because Paul Schaup knew my father, he asked him if he'd be interested in helping to sell lots. In those days, I think the Panic of 1907 came along just about that time.
Sure enough.
And, sort of held things up a little bit. In any event, the arrangement with my father, at least, was that for any lots that he sold, instead of getting a commission in cash, he got a commission in lots. And the result was that we owned quite a block of lots up around the corner of Orange and Washington, right across from the Winchester
Merriman
House,
place,
which
right,
Marjorie referred to as, in her time, as as a school for girls, was it?
Chandler School
Yes.
for Girls.
Right.
We did not build out here until 1920, but we owned the lots and paid taxes on
I
them
see.
from 1908 on.
Taxes weren't very high, were they, Ed?
Don't think so.
No. Well, that's fascinating. Gary, I assume we're talking just about the town side of Los Altos, and we'll confine it to that. We're
Right, and
talking about.
We have several pictures if you want to, and we can show them.
Incidentally, those lots sold for around $450 or $500.
Do you know, I'll tell you, I'll digress a moment, because you see, during, there was a depression, later on, and my father, who set up the feed and fuel business on First Street there, and it operated on all where the Safeway store is on across the street there. He needed additional property along First Street and down State Street, and those lots he bought for $220 and $230 during those years, less than they were first offered for years ago. Interesting.
Well, Ed, just let me interject a moment there. My father had 2 lots on Main Street between First and Second that he acquired. And when he died in 1938, we sold those 2 lots for something like $600 apiece.
Oh.
Ed, we could tell stories I'd love to tell some of the stories, but we don't have time for it. But about well, we won't get into that now. Anyway, let's do this. Marjorie, what are your first memories of Los Altos as a town, the grammar school, or your life there?
Yes, well, one of the things of course, the grammar school was the center of my attention for 8 years. And then one of the things I remember doing is going to the post office to get the mail.
Oh, yes.
And the post office is now a restaurant.
Right. I'm interested in this because a big thing for all of us kids was going to the post office in the evening.
Going to the post office.
Tell us
We
more
all
about
saw each other,
We did,
you know.
yeah.
It was the social center of
And
Los Altos.
Where is that? What restaurant is it?
It's the pasta restaurant, and it's on
Arno Reganti
corner.
has the restaurant in
Right.
there now. It's right at the
Right.
corner of First and Main.
First and Main there.
Where the
on
bullfight
that
They
is.
corner.
sometimes call it the Copeland Building,
Right.
which is kind of a misnomer, but yeah.
And that building not only was the post office, but it was also had the soda fountain,
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
which
yes.
was another thing of great interest to the elementary school children,
Right.
because on our way home.
And Mr. Copeland had those little candies back at that glass counter.
candies.
Oh, yes.
Now, is this the
And it-
grammar school that you're talking about?
That
Yes, it
is-
is.
That's
Yes,
the
it- Now,
picture.
this grammar school was built, I think, in 1912, if I recall correctly. They held school upstairs in what they call the Scout Building, where we first had our Scout meetings, Ed,
That's
before
right,
that.
yes.
But this was a very lovely building, and I was no end impressed when I moved to Los Altos and got to go to grammar
Got to go to
school.
that school. I always thought it was very fine, too. And then, of course, they improved it. About
In
the-
1922 and 23, they put
Yes,
wings on each
wings on
side,
each
and then they
side.
put an assembly hall at the back there, and that served as a community center.
And it had a really great playground in the back.
Oh,
Remember all
those
that
swings
wonderful
and-
space
and the big oak tree?
surrounded by orchards.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Well, we happen to
And,
have a class picture here that I think you're in, Marjorie. This is a real interesting looking group.
Yes. Yes, I am. And that's the class of 1922,
22, right.
apparently. Yes, there are lots of my friends in that class I recognize, too. And very good picture of Marguerite Shannon there.
Yes, she was a lovely lady.
Wasn't she a very respected by her
Oh, highly.
students?
Did she come and visit your family once in a while you're in grammar school?
I think she did.
She
yes,
did. Once a
yes.
year, she would go
She would
visit
go and
all.
visiting,
yeah.
yeah. And I think she was very well liked in the community.
Ed, what are your first memories of
You've
Los
seen
Altos?
that.
This will go to 1920. Now, well, you of course remember Los Altos before that, really,
Yes,
you were out
because
there.
my grandmother built here about 1913, and I occasionally came to visit them. Between then and January 1st, 1920, I came here and lived with them for 6 months while our house was being built on Orange Avenue. And
I remember your grandfather very well,
Yes,
Mr. Nagel.
that's
He
right.
died at age 102 or so, but he used to come
102.
by our place daily on his
And
walk.
he was, for many years, was the treasurer of the Union Church.
Right.
So, and after I came, 1920, I became 12 years old and was eligible to join the Boy Scouts. There was a Boy Scout troop, Troop Number 1 of Los Altos, that met in this building that was mentioned a moment ago, Shao Paul.
They call it the Shao
at
Paul,
the corner of 2nd and Main Street. The Scout troop met upstairs, and the grocery store, which I think was started by Marjorie's father, was on the ground floor. He was no longer in the grocery business then, but we had to be careful not to run around too much upstairs, or some of the plaster of the ceiling on the first floor came down into the groceries. And if I go on from there a minute, I think it's very interesting that some of the parents at that time and shortly after conceived the idea of building a building just for the Scouts. Scout Hall, it was opened in 1922 for the use of the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. Mrs. Paul Schaup played a part in that behind the scenes. These bunch of the men had a meeting in her home. She wasn't invited to the meeting, so she listened behind the curtain, and she decided that they weren't going to do anything, and so she came in and told them off, whereupon the Scout Hall was built. And we, at that time, had probably the finest quarters for a Scout troop for miles around. That troop still exists today as Troop 37, and it is the oldest continuous the existing troop in Santa Clara County. Goes back to about 1917, I believe. Herman Peters, a real estate agent in Los Altos, was the first scoutmaster.
Now, was Herman Peters scoutmaster when you first joined the troop, or Captain Harper?
A man named Harper,
Captain Harper,
who was a law student at Stanford, but lived in Los Altos, served as a scoutmaster.
He was my first scoutmaster too.
Right. I can remember when Edwin came to his first scout meeting, we were still in the second floor there of Shao Paul. That's my initial recollection, if you had.
Talking about that, Ed, you remember Captain Harper believed in the manual arts. He believed in men standing up for themselves, and so he used to pair us off of equal size and put these big boxing gloves on us. And I was about so high. Johnny Francisco was a year or two older, but he was small too. And my first memory of Los Altos Scouts was Johnny's beating the tar out of me with those great big gloves up above the shop in Shop Hall there. Well, that's...
I remember the Girl Scouts too.
Now, Marjorie, did they start a year or so later, didn't they?
Yes, as I recall, I didn't start until they were in the new building. And I went to Girl Scouts there then during my elementary school years. And I wonder if there's still a Girl Scout troop going on.
Oh yes, there's several in Los Altos.
Quite a few.
Gary, the building we're talking about is no longer there, but
the one that was built as the Scout Hall.
As the Scout Hall.
I was going to ask that.
But it was on First Street, across and a little way down from the railroad station.
Yes.
You see.
But didn't it become Ramsey's Garage?
No.
No, that was on the other side of...
No, I think, Marjorie, what you're thinking about, and check me on this, and I think I'm right. I think the original structure that was put on First Street there served as a utility building for the people that in 1907 put in the sidewalks and the curbs and all. Then it became a livery stable.
A livery stable.
For quite a long time. And then Charlie Budd's Garage went in there in the 1920s. Isn't that right, Ed?
Yes,
I think that's
right. The Scout Hall was right next to Budd's Garage.
To Budd's Garage, that's right.
It served actually as more than a Scout Hall, if you remember.
Right.
There were basketball games.
The men's club met for dinner meetings once a month. The county library had the front room on one corner. The Catholic Church held services there for some time. The Los Altos Grammar School had its graduation there in a year before the auditorium was built.
I'd forgotten that, sure enough, yeah. Isn't that well? One of the things I remember about that hall was, of course, we used to play basketball in there, and
That's
it was
what
small.
I remember too.
It was small for a basketball court, and they had rafters overhead, Edgar, at about age 17, was the only one that consistently make a basket through the rafter and into the basket because it was so
Floyd
low.
Gray could make
He
his
did pretty
share
well,
too.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting a little bit of feel for what early Los Altos was like, and talking about the Robinson's grocery store and the Scout Hall and some of the early buildings there. We haven't touched much on the railroad and the impact of the railroad and the railroad station. And I know we've got a lot of pictures which we can intersperse in here. But we are unfortunately already running out of time, so we want to make sure we spend some time talking about the railroad and the influence.
Well, now Ed has pretty well given the background of how the SP.
We could elaborate on it a little. There not only was a track for steam trains, but there was also a parallel track for electric interurban, which ran from San Jose to Monte Vista and then down through Los Altos and into Palo Alto, and connected up with a line out to Stanford University. The interurban cars operated hourly. I guess the last one probably left Palo Alto 10 o'clock at night. The first one would have been 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And the steam trains, when I came here in 1920, there were 2 trains going eastward. They both went as far as Santa Cruz. And one westward. And then shortly after that, they put on a commute service. It was a train early in the morning that originated in Los Gatos and came through here at about 20 minutes after 7, and then came back about 6:15 at night. And that was a fairly substantial sized train with stopped all the way along between Palo Alto and Los Gatos. I commuted on it for several years. And I'm sure that both the electric line and the steam train, back in the days before you had many automobiles, had a lot to do with building up Los Altos as a residential area.
But you see, Gary, Marjorie and Ed and I all commuted to high school on that electric line.
Is that right?
I went to Palo Alto High School.
Well, Marjorie and I were talking earlier. I find it ironic that here, this many years later, we are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars building a new electric rail system through Silicon Valley because it's more efficient.
You know, that stopped almost instantaneously when automobiles became popular, because that line was discontinued in 1933. When I went to high school, and I'm sure with Marjorie and Ed also, the cars in the morning were just packed. You could hardly get aboard, and people used those continuously. But as soon as the automobile came along,
We not only went to high school, but we used to go to San Jose for shopping, and went to Palo Alto. You know, we used the cars for everything.
When did the car become that much influence that the train started?
Well, the line ran from 1910 to 1933, but I would guess it reached its peak probably in our years, because the population was gradually growing in Los Altos, and it was a very useful means of transportation to all of us.
Middle 20s would be when the automobile really began to encroach on railroad traffic, passenger traffic.
And of course, the steam train used to run, not necessarily full from Los Altos. It picked up some at South Palo Alto, but it used to run full going to San Francisco, the commute train. I commuted on it, Ed, for years. Your dad commuted.
And our fathers commuted
to the city.
Guy Schaup and my father, all of the men that we knew.
And it was kind of exciting, Gary. And you know, in the morning there, we'd all gather at the station. The kids would be going to high school, and all the men would be going to work, and their wives would drive up in their Kerbers or whatever, you know, and let the husband out. And so that was a pretty busy place in the morning, just as the post office was in the evening.
Interesting thing there, that morning train that I mentioned, about 7:20, there was an electric interurban car that went parallel to it at that same time in the morning. The electric car could go faster than the train. But the track wasn't maintained for that highest speed on the steam train. The electric car would have to stop at Alta Mesa. We'd start out from Los Altos about the same time. The electric car would get ahead to Alta Mesa, and then when we stopped there, the train would go by us. And then the electric car would go after the train, and if everything would work just right, we'd go about 70 miles an hour and catch it before we got to the highway at El Camino.
I remember that very well. I do.
I do too.
You know, You might be interested in our impressions of the town site, are the first ones that we have. My first impression of the town site of Los Altos was a big hayfield with a few buildings in it, because this is what I remember from 1920. There were only, 3 places of business on Main Street, plus a residence down the line, plus the grammar school, and then a few places up and down First Street and on State Street. The rest of it was all hayfields, but in the hayfields, they had put the curbs and the sidewalks.
Right. That's
So
the big
as a-
advertising. The curbs and sidewalks are.
Right, they were already, but the streets
Right.
were
Right.
dirt and gravel, you see. So one of my first memories is the first bicycle I got was riding down some of those sidewalks out in a bare field with the wild oats growing up through the cracks, so it was like going through a forest. you know.
Well, you're not going to believe this, but we have about 30 seconds left. We obviously need to have all 3 of you come back, because I really am interested in your impressions of what Los Altos is like now. We are going to have a program later on in our series that deals with taking a walking tour, which Ed is responsible for, a walking tour of the city of Los Altos. And we're hoping that everyone will be watching that program and tune in and learn about where you can go in the area of Los Altos now to see these things that these fine people have been talking about. We hope you'll tune in again. We want to thank you for being with us on this episode of Los Altos History. Thank you.